Hey you guys, so I want to do a video where I share several games now. I've done one of these already on the London system, and this one's going to be slightly different. So I'm going to share a bunch of games using a different opening, and it's going to be the Scandinavian Defence, all of which were won inside of 20 moves. So I want to inspire you that maybe the Scandinavian might be something that you'd like to try out, and show you some different ways that the Scandinavian can go and different kinds of attacks that can come out of it. Okay, so the Scandinavian Defence. Now, the other thing is I'm going to build up in terms of rating as well. So I'm going to start with players under 1,000 and move up in rating as we go through these games. Okay, so it starts with 1e4, and here the Scandinavian is to play 1d5 as black. So you're offering up a pawn early on. The pawn obviously is defended by the queen. Now the standard response is for white to take, which is you'll see most often. In this case, white chooses to push e5. Now maybe that's not a great response, because basically you're moving your opening pawn a second time, thereby giving black the opportunity to start developing pieces much more early. So in a way you could say that this has lost white the first move advantage already. So in this game I play c5, knight to c3, and then d4, simply kicking the knight, so trying to gain more space here on the queen side and to gain some initiative by forcing the knight to move. So the knight here moves to b5, and bear in mind that my opponent here is rated 688. Okay, now I kick the knight again with a6. The knight now moves back to a3, and now bishop to f5 is played. So I'm starting to eye up maybe the c2 square. Bishop comes out to c4, and I push e6, so preventing this stray pawn from advancing any further up the board, and also blocking off this bishop's access to the f7 square, which at the beginning of the game is black's weakest square. Reason is that it's defended only by the king, so if it's very often attacked by, say, a bishop and queen combination, or a bishop and knight combination with a knight coming in here as well. Okay, so d3 is played, defends the bishop, and now I come in with a queen check, forcing pretty much c3. I guess an alternative could have been to block with the bishop, or potentially block with the queen. c3 was played, and now I simply come back, retreat the queen. So now we have f3, now I capture, and pawn recaptures. So this is looking okay for black at this point in time. This knight, I think on a3 is a little bit awkward and doesn't really have a way into the game either. Now I develop my knight from b and quickly castle. So this pawn that's just advanced cannot now capture on c5 because the queen would be falling to the rook. So he advances the pawn, I capture, bishop captures. Okay, what that's doing is it's self-pinning the bishop. He's now pinned his own piece. So again, the bishop cannot capture there or there, even though this pawn on f7 is hanging. Okay, so I simply move my knight out of the way and grab a pawn. So I have two attackers on this pawn, only one defender, because I've got my knight and my queen. So I capture, white captures, and I recapture with the queen with checks. Now I'm just one pawn up. King moves out of the way. I think a better move would probably be to block with the bishop and retain castling rights, because the king's now ready to castle on that side of the board. Anyway, king moves out the way. I grab another pawn, and now I'm threatening this rook on a1. Bishop blocks, and that's a blunder really, because the bishop's moving to a square where it's undefended. I don't capture the bishop, but I do put the queen here on d3, where it's looking both at white's king, so it's coming with check, and looking at the queen, and looking at this bishop as well. So it's a three-way fork. It should pretty much be forcing white to exchange queens. but here white decides against and moves the king back to e1. Okay, so this is not very accurate play. Okay, so I move my rook to e8 with check, and blocking with the bishop again doesn't achieve anything because rook to e4 is pretty crushing. The king's got nowhere to go, no squares. The only legal move is queen to e2, and then queen takes queen is a nice checkmate. Next game. Okay, so now we are above 1,000. I've got an opponent rated 1174. And again, e4, d5. Now pawn takes d5, which is the standard move. And I'm playing the modern variation here. I don't like capturing with a queen because it just falls always into knight to c3, kicking the queen. And what's the point in having to move the queen again? Okay, so I like this modern variation, and it can lead to something called the Icelandic gambit. We don't have any examples of the Icelandic gambit here, but I do have a separate video on it, which you might like to check out. So here, white makes kind of a common inaccuracy, let's say, by trying to defend this pawn. Okay, so he's got double pawns on the d file. That's one of the advantages for black. So you've given up a pawn, but you've doubled white's pawns on the d file, and you've opened the e file towards the king. Generally in a gambit, trying to hang on to your extra pawn can lead to all kinds of problems. So here, this is the Icelandic gambit, okay, but it doesn't have the crushing win that is sometimes played. So in the Icelandic palm gambit, you offer up a second pawn, and then if white takes, then recapturing with the bishop is the standard move. So then the idea there's a trap in this, which is to put your queen behind the bishop on e7. Remember, this e file is now completely open. And then what you're trying to do is maybe move the bishop and capture material with a discovered check from the queen there. Okay, so let's see how this one goes. Knight comes out to f3. I develop my knight, so I don't do this, don't attempt this trap at this point. Bishop comes out, and now my knight attacks the bishop. Bishop's actually undefended there. And white misses the threat and simply castles. So I grab the bishop, I'm a minor piece in front, and now I grab another bishop, just solidifying my advantage. So now white has no bishops on the board, and I've got both bishops. Queen comes forward to d7, preparing to castle queenside. Knight comes out to c3, and then I castle. So I've got a nice queen and a rook on this file now. Notice this pawn is hanging as well. Now a4 is played, and I come in with a direct attack. So I'm going to, because I'm a piece up, I sacrifice my bishop. Pawn recaptures, queen recaptures. So I've got two pawns in return for my bishop. So it's only a slight disadvantage. But my queen is in a very threatening place, and this knight is now undefended. Queen moves across to defend the knight. But now, look, I've got a bishop and a knight that can come in with ideas of a quick checkmate. Okay, rook comes out, maybe potentially giving the king an escape square. So if I can play queen h2 at some point, at least the king has potentially a way out. But it all goes south pretty quickly now. Knight comes into g4. Knight comes there to attack the queen, but it's not very well thought through because now I have queen to h2 check, and there's only one move, and there we go. Checkmate. Ready for another one? Okay, this one is against an opponent rated 1192. We have e4, d5, e takes d5, and knight to f6, the modern variation. Now here the knight comes out to defend the pawn, which I see a lot. Something I quite often do here is capture the pawn. Then if knight recaptures, I've got queen recaptures. And the difference there of recapturing with the queen straight away on the second move is that there's no knight now to come out and kick the queen. Okay, but anyway, so instead of capturing, I push e6, pawn takes, and bishop takes. And now we've got that same situation. I could potentially slip my queen in there, maybe like pretending that I'm about to castle queenside, which is not a bad idea anyway, because the d file is now semi-open. Knight comes out to f3, I develop my other bishop, d4 is played to kick the bishop, and I simply retreat to b6, and now white plays his dark squared bishop out to b3, I castle kingside, the last bishop is developed, and now I develop my last minor piece, so I've got all my minor pieces are now on the board and uncastled. White's minor pieces are also all developed, so he's getting ready to castle next. And bishop comes out, pinning the knight on f6 against the queen, and I'm now move my rook across, potentially preparing a discovered check by moving the bishop somewhere. Bishop captures the knight on f6. Now, I've got a choice at this point because I could simply recapture the bishop, but I've also got the option of an in-between move. I don't have to recapture the bishop with probably the queen, but the pawn's also possible, because I've got a discovered check if I want to play that. But there's no real advantage at this point, so I recapture with the queen, and now a pawn pushes forwards, apparently with a pawn fork on the bishop and the knight. But what white misses in this case is, if this bishop moves, then it comes with check, with the discovery by the rook. Okay, so bishop takes pawn. He's just basically given me a free pawn because that discovers this check, and now white has to do something about that check. So he retreats his own bishop, which was probably not the best move, because now I could have, for example, bishop takes f3, which is indeed what I play in the game, and now the bishop can't recapture because the bishop itself is pinned. So again, blocking a check by putting one of your own pieces in the way is effectively pinning that piece. So I capture the knight, and he has to recapture with a pawn. So now he's got doubled isolated pawns on the f file and an isolated pawn on the h file. So severely weakened position. In addition, white has not yet castled. So I centralise my final rook to d8, hitting the queen. Queen has to move, and now white is really looking on the ropes. So I can come in with the queen, I can grab that pawn on f3 because its only defender is still pinned. Queen comes out, excuse the dogs. Queen comes out, but a queen on its own here is not going to be effective. It's still going to have to bring the rook over to g1 to have any ideas of attack, but it's not going to be hard to defend. So I come in now with another capture on the pawn, and that is a neat little checkmate. The queen's protected here by my bishop, and the whole d-file is covered by my rook, so nice little checkmate there. Alright, let's go to another game. Here now my opponent is rated 1199. I was rated 1245 at this point. And e4 is played, d5, pawn takes, knight to f6. And now d4, this is actually the best move. It allows queen to capture, knight comes out to harass the queen. But notice that because the d4 pawn has moved now, I could also have had like queen to a5 pinning the knight, is another possibility. I just retreat my queen to d8. And now we have four knights out on the board. Bishop comes in front of the king. Bishop develops. White castles. Knight to b4. Bishop to b5 check is not very threatening because it allows me just to push this pawn. Also then opens up this diagonal for my queen if I want it. And white's going to lose a tempo by having to move the bishop. I now push a5, defends the knight. a3 attacks the knight, so I centralise my knight onto d5. White centralises his knight, and we exchange knights here, so doubling white's pawns there on the c-file. I now push a pawn forward, and white spots a sacrifice here, sacrificing the knight. Now if I recapture with the pawn, then we have bishop takes pawn, and that comes with check, so with a fork on the king and the rook. So my queen's under threat at this point, so I simply move the queen out of the way. Also noting, I have to move my queen to a square that this knight cannot attack on its next move, because as soon as this knight moves, it comes with check, right? So if I'd move my queen to any of these squares, yeah. In fact, any square that this knight can attack on its next move. So for example, if I move to here, right, the knight can then move to a7, attacking the queen, and it comes with check, so I would lose my queen. Right? So I have to move it to a square that I know this knight can't attack in 2 jumps. So you need to remember the patterns of those. Okay, now, so the knight moves out to the way, discovered check. This is now not looking great for black. I'm forced to move my king to e7. Now the queen comes out. Now I develop my knight, centralise my other knight. Bishop comes out to defend the pawn on c3. Now I push f6 to kick white's knight away. White counterattacks with an attack on my bishop, maybe potentially weakening the king's security here. So I simply move my bishop back, black captures, and I capture with the h-pawn. This now has the advantage of releasing, opening up the h-file potentially for my rook, and you can see that there is a serious threat here, with the queen potentially coming straight into h2 with checkmate. Does white spot this move? No, it completely misses the threat. Queen to h2 is a shocking checkmate, because white really did have the upper hand in this particular game. Let's go to another one. Okay, now we're above 1200, and e4, d5, pawn takes, knight to f6. d4, best move. Bishop develops. Bishop develops. Knight, in this case, captures the extra pawn. And now knight comes out to c3, and completely missing the fact that this knight was threatening the bishop. The bishop was undefended, so I'm again a piece up. Knight develops, bishop develops, e6, blocking off the diagonal. Now white castles, and I develop my queen. So I've now got 2 attackers on this pawn. White has 2 defenders, but I have the option as well of castling long and putting my rook immediately onto the semi-open d-file. So white centralises a rook, I castle, so now I have 3 attackers on this piece. Does white notice the threat? Yes, and decides to advance the pawn. So it's now attacking this knight here. It's defended twice by knight and queen. It's attacked, however, 3 times. Pawn, knight, and rook. So I could actually simply have just captured the pawn at that point, but I spot a potential checkmate as well. Now, white has to spot the checkmate threat, fails to spot it, boom. Queen dives in, checkmate, game over. Thank you for playing. Let's move on. My opponent now is rated 1253, and we have the same kind of opening, and here again white attempts to defend his extra pawn by playing c4. It's not a terrible move. Again, we have the Icelandic gambit. Pawn takes, as it very often does, because white's here thinking, I've got this extra pawn, but it's a doubled pawn, and so if I get the opportunity to swap it off, then that's got to be good for me. Okay, bishop takes, pawn to b2, giving him this pawn structure, bit of a chain, and now again you can see queen to e7 with this threat of the discovered attack potentially winning material. So I think, bishop takes c4 would be a free pawn. Queen moves into the way, as we have seen before. Knight to c6, knight to f3, and castles queenside, taking advantage again of the semi-open d-file. Bishop comes out to attack the queen. Queen simply retreats to e8, and now we have d3 and g6. So I'm getting ready maybe to fianchetto this bishop, taking advantage of the fact that this dark square diagonal is completely open. Knight comes out, blocking that diagonal to a degree, but remember the knight's not defended. So I fianchetto the bishop. Bishop comes back in defence. Rook moves across where it's out of line of white's dark square bishop. Knight comes in, and we swap off knights, and white recaptures here with his queen. But now, if you see, because that knight has moved, white could recapture here, but possibly, maybe arguably should have traded off the bishops first, but he chose to capture with the queen. I then grab his bishop, rook comes across, simply back to c3 with check. Knight blocks, so now bishop takes knight would have forced the king to move, really, or probably recapture. But instead, I move here with an attack on the queen. Okay, so the queen's actually pinned. It can't move, so it pretty much is going to force an exchange of queens. And now obviously the rook on g recaptures on e8, so the king is now in check. King pretty much has to move. And now bishop comes in, bishop swap off, and then rook takes d2 is another beautiful checkmate. Next game. Here my opponent is rated 1361. So the Scandinavian pawn takes, knight to f6, and now d3, which is a reasonable move. Does open up this diagonal towards the king, of course. Queen captures the spare pawn, and h3. Pretty quiet move, but it stops ideas of either the knight or the bishop coming out to g4. I then push e5, trying to gain some control over the centre. Knight develops to c3, hitting the queen, and now here's the move that I mentioned before. Queen to a5 means that that knight is now pinned against the king. So bishop intervenes to break the pin, and very, very common move that you'll see here, simply queen to b6 now, hitting the b2 pawn that has just been undefended with that bishop move. White misses that threat and develops a knight instead. And now, instead of capturing the spare pawn, I simply develop my dark squared bishop on the same diagonal as my queen, looking down at the vulnerable f2 square. White again misses this threat and instead just develops his final bishop. So bishop comes in now to f2 with check, and there's only one move. King has to go to f1. Now I develop my knight. Pawn is pushed on c3. I bring my bishop out of the way, clearly with another checkmate threat. And it's, I think here, bishop to e1 is probably the only sensible move. Otherwise, no, white has to block this diagonal somehow. But white here is not playing his best game, clearly, as a 1361 player, and pushes a pawn and falls to a shocking checkmate. So there you go. There's a handful of games, all in the Scandinavian as black, and using the modern variation, which is my preferred way to do it. Maybe it inspires you to play the Scandinavian for yourself. It can be, as we've seen, fun and aggressive, and can lead to some good checkmates. So yeah, I think there's a few common themes that have emerged in this. Hopefully going through these games pretty quickly has given you a feel for this kind of opening. Maybe it's something you'd like to try out for yourself, but if nothing else, it's been fun going through some quick games. So hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed myself, and I'll see you soon.